All right, hello everyone. Thank you for tuning into my presentation. My name is Matt, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the National Prohibition Act. Sometimes people refer to it as the Noble Experiment, and this simply is just the time in American history when we outlawed alcohol and just essentially made it illegal. And today I'm going to be focusing mainly on interest groups and the idea of federalism and how they are related. So, just to give you sort of a little bit of background information, this all sort of started with the idea of temperance. And what temperance means is just abstaining from alcohol. It means just to not drink alcohol. And in the years following the Civil War and up to this period of time that we're talking about right now, there's this progressive movement happening in America. And there's a disdain for alcohol because of the violence that some families are enduring and just the drunkenness in general of American um, society. And there are there are two groups specifically who really want to change that. They want to make sure that we are going down a path that, in this point in time, America's very religious. They want to make sure that we're following the footsteps of God and continuing to do things right for ourselves and for our families. So that's where this sort of is headed. And just to give you some background specifically on what the act is, it is the ratification of the 18th Amendment in 1919. And then it went into effect 1 year later with the adoption of the Volstead Act according to Hall 2010. Now, the actual amendment itself says that the importation, manufacture, and transportation of intoxicating beverages was now illegal. But the Volstead Act itself and its adoption made it clear that anything that was 0.5% alcohol or higher was now going to be illegal. Now, it wasn't illegal to drink, but according to Ian Tyrrell, the act itself actually was just a small part of a larger national push for reform. Now, this was something that was going to be definitely hard to enforce because this was something that was based off of preference. A lot of people didn't really take it seriously and they didn't really think that it was going to affect them, let alone anybody else, right? So, um, what we're going to sort of transition into now is first the interest groups. So, one of the most influential interest groups during this period of time was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Now, it was led by a woman named Frances Willard. This group was a group of women that was focused on women's rights and the right to vote. And what Tyrrell, 1997, states is that their goal was to protect women. Right? They wanted to change the deeply rooted cultural norms that were present in society. Right? Because a lot of the time when it comes to alcohol, you can make an argument that you know the women are the ones who are the victims of drunkenness, right? And at this point in time, they don't have the right to vote. So they really wanted a voice, and they really wanted to make sure that they could change things for themselves and women all across the country, right? So, I mean, they are really extremely important to our history at this point in time and the way we look at interest groups today. The second biggest group that I'm going to talk about is the Anti-Saloon League. Now, this was founded by a man named Wayne Wheeler, and it was known to be one of the most influential interest groups in American history, according to Lee and Clay in 2018. Now, um, this group was funded by evangelical Protestant churches, right? Um, this was a group that really wanted political change. They wanted people that had lost their way with God to sort of be brought back into having a relationship with Him. Because remember, in this time in history, America was still a very religious country, right? I mean, we still are today, but at this point in time, we focused on it a lot more than different times in our history. Um, so, what these groups did specifically is what I'm going to move on to next. So, according to Lay and Clayton 2018 as well, these groups were in almost total control of the legislative process. Um, the dominant political parties that we think of, the Republican and Democratic parties at this point, were almost unimportant. They weren't even relevant because these groups were the ones who were in control. They used the major parties as almost like just an actor to get their point across. And, these groups were just absolutely way too big to ignore. They just had such a strong force. And they had the ability to threaten politicians and say, look, if you don't start to move toward things and ideas that we want, we're going to threaten your seat. We're going to threaten the election. And um, Wayne Hall, 2010, explains that these groups were not only appealing to business interests, they're also appealing to the interests of the people. Um, in regard to businesses, they were arguing that less drinking meant more productivity for workers, less accidents, less legal costs. Right? They were going to take some stress off of um, the the manufacturers themselves, and they also pointed to, this author also pointed to the fact that more economic growth means less drinking and better monetary decision making, which is all around better for families and just the population in general, right? And these people were just very, very successful because they had their minds set on one thing specifically, and they really weren't going to let too much get in their way. Um, you know, Hall also points to the fact that at this time in history, in the 20s, what we call the Roaring 20s, some people like to point the finger and say, look, a lot of this success is because of prohibition. But a lot of other people will argue and say, no, it's sort of what Hall was saying in the fact that the economy was actually good due to better efficiencies in production and higher incomes for people as well. Now, Lay and Clayton 2018 also point out that these groups built very strong coalitions, right? The parties themselves, the major parties, didn't really have a whole lot of control over it. And if they wanted to stay in a position of power, they were forced to take a position on it because up until now, they really didn't even take a position on it at all because they didn't see it as being worth the time. Um, Ian Tyrrell, 1997, says that these groups had so much success because they had an education strategy, right? It wasn't just let's go out and say a bunch of different things. It was let's target the youth, let's target as many people as we possibly can and use education as a weapon. I mean, even in today's society, we can see that working in a multitude of different ways. Um, you know, these people these groups specifically, I should say, they make the change possible because in this point in time, they were really, really pressuring these politicians. Michael Munger and Thomas Schaller, 1997, also state that the secret to their success and the secret to a lot of success with any interest group for that matter is the fact that they have the ability to persuade and have a very targeted outreach program. They can really, really get their point across, and they just because it's their one subject that they really push hard on. And as we've learned from our readings and as we've learned from class as well, this is something that transitions through all of the periods of time that we have as a country. I mean, the voice of the people is very, very important in our society, and getting that voice out through a certain group is is just very, very influential and powerful. And this is a great, great example of that. So now I want to sort of switch gears into the idea of federalism. Um, Prohibition serves as a great example for this because it goes directly back to what Madison feared when they were trying to, draft the Constitution. And Michael Munger and Thomas Schaller also talk about how Madison was so afraid of factions, right? We go back to that idea that we didn't want certain groups being in control. And Madison was correct. I mean, in this point in time, we have wet states and we have dry states. The wet states were the ones who wanted to continue to drink, and the dry states were the ones who didn't. And in order to combat things like this, the founders themselves wanted to create a balance by making the amendment process not too difficult, but also not too easy as well. And the just in general, they wanted to document the Constitution itself to be adaptable to changes in circumstances, but only when there was this actual consensus. And as Michael Munger and Thomas Schaller also point out as well, when we think of the Constitution and the amendments that are in it, the Bill of Rights, a lot of the time people think of this document to be something that sets restrictions on what government can do and why. And that being true, this amendment is very different from that idea because the 18th Amendment actually puts restrictions on what the citizens are allowed to do, not the government itself. So this is why it was so difficult to enforce, because it was something that you could almost say was destined to fail because it was based on a preference. It wasn't something that people said, yes, this is a difference between right and wrong, or good and evil, or um, beneficial or not beneficial. For some people, it could be. Some people argue it is. Some people argue it isn't. But when it from a legislative perspective, that's very preference is very hard to enforce. Um, and Lay and Clayton also leads you to understand that you know once the amendment was ratified, or actually before the amendment, excuse me, was ratified, there were a number of states who actually had their own laws regarding temperance. Some states you could drink, and then some states were more strict on what you could and couldn't do. So, that sort of gives you the other underlying idea of federalism, where we have this understanding that there's the federal government and the state government. Each one is united under the country as a whole, but each of them has their own responsibility and their own power. And Lane Clayton also explained that the long-term effects of this amendment in in the long term and in the short term, you can see how the effects really, really have a huge upbringing in the expansion of federal and state enforcement agencies and how those two interact with each other. Because you got to remember that in this point in time, um, the Volstead Act itself helped create uh, the government, the federal government itself, to really sort of this is an example of encroachment, right? The National Prohibition Unit was created in response to everything going on, and there was an there was just such an increase in a need to police everything, and the federal government said, look, we think we need to step in because once we've gotten 10 years, 11 years into this experiment, the um, the corruption itself is getting to be very, very high. And the federal government says we need to step in and take care of this corruption because the states at this point have not been able to really keep it under control. But what happens is the states come back and they say, look, you know, we know that you have our back, but we don't want you telling us how to run our states, how to enforce the people that are closest to us, And we're here to argue that, you don't really deserve to come in here and tell us what to do. Because originally, the plan for the amendment was that it was supposed to be a joint effort. But it didn't work because people didn't follow the rules like, anybody does at any point in time in history. And so once you get to, $6 billion having been spent, the federal government says, look, we got to do something about this. And so, there's this huge spike in violence. There's this huge spike in crime that we've never seen before, and people don't know how to handle it. They can't do it on their own, so they're looking for somebody else to come and help. One of a big example, even of some of the violence that happened, was St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which was um, a killing of 7 different gangsters all in a row, just point blank, and the papers got a hold of it, and it was a real turning point. It was a huge article, and it really made people question whether or not they were going to be safe in these cities, and whether or not they could get a hold on the crime. And so, once we get to that point, people are saying, okay, look, what are we going to do about it? We need a lot of states and a lot of different people are saying, look, we want this thing, repealed. We want to get it out. We want to give control to the states. But the thing is, the states and the federal government are arguing back and forth as to how we're going to get it done. And I'm going to go a little bit more into specifics about that right now. Um, by the time the stock exchange crashes and the economic instability starts to set in, public opinion is going to ultimately really shift, as Tyrell 1997 states. I mean, it's almost the nail in the coffin to this experiment, um, and the federal and state governments are very close to um, you know getting a repeal. Right, the 21st Amendment goes into would be the amendment that goes into effect that would ultimately repeal the 18th. But again, there's an argument back and forth as to how it's going to happen, because the Constitution itself states that there's 2 ways to actually amend the document. The first way is to do it normally, where Congress proposes the amendment, and then 2/3 have to agree on it, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures have to agree on it. But there's also a second way, which allows the state legislatures to call for ratifying conventions in each one of those states to bypass the state legislatures. And that would allow the citizens themselves to vote on the act. But this is where the argument comes in. The 14th Amendment, Article 5, states that the Congress has the ability to police the actual amendment process, but it's not specific on the actual state ratifying conventions. So the Congress says we're going to come in and we're going to get this thing done and it'll be over. But the states say, hold on a second, we want control, because the Constitution doesn't specifically say who controls all of those things. So for a number of years, this is gonna go back and forth, and eventually, as Lay and Clayton state, the control is eventually going to go to the states, because the southern states that were needed for the majority vote refused to sign on unless they were given control of the actual conventions on a state by state basis. So by 1933, people are essentially fed up, and um, the the experiment of prohibition ends in December of that year, with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, which repeals the 18th Amendment that had been put in place 14 years prior. And according to Munger and Schaller in 1997, this is actually the only amendment that has ever been placed um, into the Constitution that repeals an amendment that had been put in prior. And that's the only example of the 27 that we have so far that's actually been the case. Um, Michael Munger and Thomas Schaller also point to the fact that the depression itself and the stock exchange crash were so influential and had such a big effect on people that um, government assistance and different government programs were going to lead the way. And the man who was going to capitalize on that was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who essentially changed what it means for the federal government to have a purpose in your life. So many people needed help, and so many people needed an outreach program that, you know, it had to be done. And so, those things that he has put into place, or he did put in place back then, have continued to rise and, excuse me, continue to get bigger for the federal government up until today. And so, honestly, you can make a pretty good argument as to the influence and power of the bureaucracies that we have today, and the the wide range and scope of government, federal government programs that we have today can be pretty much directly linked back to this um, very weird kind of social experiment that we call prohibition. So that's pretty much all I have for you guys. I appreciate you tuning in again, and if you want to learn more about it, I myself thought it was very interesting. You can learn a lot about it online. There's a great documentary by Ken Burns if you want to go check that out. But again, I appreciate you sticking with me for this presentation, and I hope all of you also do excellent on your exam grades. So um, that's all I got for you, and have a good one.